The question is, where does this leave us? And what is Iran's real trajectory? Again, because I've already discussed on several occasions what the Iranians could do, the question being above all what they would like to do. In my last video, I reminded you that Iran is not a nuclear power, that Iran is not in a phase of revenge imperialism, it's in a phase of initial imperialism like the German Empire in the 1940s or the USSR in the 1940s. In this case, escalation and fight is distinct. Escalation and combat are different. We're in the continuation of something. In this case, in other words, we're following in the footsteps of the same imperialism that set up the regime and imperial ambitions in the country concerned. In the case of Iran, this regime is the mullahs who emerged from the Iranian Revolution, which, as I've already said, was a national revolution, but did not enter its normal phase of imperial revenge. Otherwise, it would be a parliamentary democracy today. Iran would be a parliamentary democracy, but on the contrary, was attacked by Iraq, which led to a war that was very hard on Iran, which led to the relegitimization of the power of the mullahs and turned them into a kind of new old Iranian regime, which is restarting its imperial and regional ambitions. And we're going to take a closer look at this because you might be aware, as I mentioned it in my book regarding the quest for vengeance by imperialists, initial imperialism consists, in fact, at the moment when in any case is visible, I remind you that initial imperialism is that which, once defeated, then gives rise to the appearance of revenge imperialism in reaction. In the case of Russia, for example, it's imperialism, it's the emerging from the Great Patriotic War, also known as the Second World War. The Soviet Empire rose to prominence as a predominant global power. Its influence and dominance greatly impacted the world, with Vladimir Putin. So naturally, the ambitions of this initial imperialism are different from those of the revenge imperialism. Initial imperialism, in fact, it appears from the moment when a national nucleus reaches a position of power, generally following an often difficult war. I'm thinking of the Great Patriotic War. I'm thinking of the wars of Louis XIV, in particular the War of the Spanish Succession, which France almost lost. There are times when things go more smoothly, such as the creation of the German Empire. We were crushed in France in the year of the German Empire, but it could have been much harder for the Germans. And so for Iran, the Iran-Iraq war was the founding conflict. The conflict helped Iran assert itself as a sovereign power in the face of the world, so to speak, and thus to place itself among the leading powers in a certain frame of reference. Now, this may be a global frame of reference, as in most cases, but it may also be a more local one. I refer to what I said about the trajectory of Serbia, whose Yugoslavia was also a kind of national empire, a kind of small-scale SSR. So local, if you like, or relative to the Balkan frame of reference. So that makes you the dominant power on a certain scale. His victory, Iran's victory in the Iran-Iraq war. The conflict was indecisive, of course, but as long as you were the aggressor, you could say that resisting and holding on to your borders in the end was your victory. On the Iraqi side, of course, it's more dubious. You could say that in a way Iraq has lost, since they didn't manage to conquer what they wanted. At the same time, Saddam Hussein could consider himself victorious in the sense that this war had enabled him to put a brake on and completely halt even the Iranian attempts to destabilize Iraq, which had already begun before the invasion of Iran and had even motivated Iraq's invasion of Iran. Iran's resistance to the West confirmed during Iraq's invasion as a power resisting the West, a status that was further reinforced a few years after the end of the Iraq war. But as early as the UGT years, the USSR collapsed. From the UGT years, finally, Iran, even if marginal, and the United States, the great phase of the solitary superpower. However, it became a state, especially after Saddam Hussein's fall, that resists the United States while at the same time being in great tension with them. And that's where Iran's pride really lies. I was just watching a speech given by Qasem Soleimani, we'll come back to that later, the man who was killed by Donald Trump in the early 20s, who was a hero of the Iran-Iraq war, who in his speech said Iraq and the whole world were at war with Iran. So there really is this desire to impose itself on the whole world. So the initial war, the one that in fact founded the empire, founded this imperial identity and this vision of an even more imperial destiny, so to speak, i.e. of a power that, having resisted all enemies, will be able to dominate regionally or worldwide if you're on a larger scale. I'm thinking of the USSR, for example, whose goal after Stalin was to catch up with the USA and become the world's dominant power. In the world, they believed they achieved this in 1970s, when their stockpile of nuclear weapons surpassed that of the Americans, when the Americans suffered in Vietnam, when there was Watergate, etc., and when they themselves obtained the signing of the Helsinki agreements in Seoul. It was really this ascendant period. Similarly, if you think of Germany Germany, having founded the German Empire, found itself in a position both to be the leading power on the continent, but also to hope to wrest power, the status of leading world power, entirely world power, in the British Empire. So this ambition, which is that of initial imperialism, when faced with obstacles, the feeling of revenge can lead to the desire for expansion through imperialism. A conflict or a series of conflicts or a period of time. I'm thinking in particular of the SSR, even if Afghanistan was indeed a hot conflict, a conflict that's going to go very badly. But the conflict at first, and when the authority involved initiates it, it is perceived as being the conflict or as part of a conflict that will finally bring it to the coveted status of dominant regional or dominant. So that means Iran is at that stage. So we have to ask ourselves what exactly Iran's ambitions are today. From the moment we ask ourselves what Iran is going to do and why it is going to do it. So before coming back to this subject, let's take a quick look at what's been happening over the last few days. What is Iran's strategic situation? Currently, at the moment, since the start of the conflict, in Gaza, Iran is gradually gaining power and asserting itself globally and is entering into a confrontation, albeit generally indirect, with the United States and Israel. Let's put aside what happened with Pakistan. I'll put it aside right away. What happened with Pakistan is rather in this context and in this climate, there is perhaps an Iranian feverishness and impatience. And after the attack on Qasem Soleimani's commemoration ceremony, which left almost 100 people dead, there is an Iranian desire to punish the terrorists. Unfortunately, they don't necessarily have terrorists on hand everywhere. They have identified some of them, and these terrorists have infiltrated via Afghanistan. And in fact, the main problem today, let's say, since the defeat of the Islamic State, since the Islamic State was defeated, the main threat still coming from the Islamic State in any case no longer comes from Iraq and Syria. It comes essentially, the rear bases in Afghanistan and Pakistan are where it originates from. And so particularly in the Baluchistan region, which straddles the two, in this area you have Pakistani separatists operating from Iranian territory and Iranian Baluchi separatists operating from Pakistani territory, working from Pakistani territory. So in fact what the Iranians did was to shoot Iranian terrorists in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis retaliated by shooting Pakistani terrorists in Iran. At least that's what they said on both sides. It seems that now we're moving towards de-escalation, so there won't be a war on that side, if you like. It's not on that side, but it does send out a signal about the determination and perhaps the will to fight of the guardians of the revolution, who quite clearly are totally in power in Iran today. In other words, they are the ones who have really taken the upper hand over any other power, and that's important. It's important because precisely at the end of the initial imperialism, this is often what happens. There's a kind of military even-handedness that leads to these adventures. This was the case, for example, in the German Empire on the eve of the First World War. And so it is intriguing to witness the persisting tension that has been recurring for around 3 to 4 months now. The current state of affairs holds much interest in 2019. In 2019, you'll remember that Donald Trump had been in power in the White House for some time. He had denounced the Iran nuclear deal and resumed sanctions. As a result, Iran was once again in economic difficulty. There had been some internal unrest, moreover, and Iran had resumed forms of escalation with strikes against Saudi refineries, blaming it on the Houthis, always the same thing. But the strikes were probably coming from Iran, hitting oil tankers, etc., knocking down the American right too. Can you put up the 2020 map, Leo, please, which was a map that had been published in Le Monde that summarized what happened at the time Qasem Soleimani was killed. The American response at the time was to shoot Qasem Soleimani. Why was this? Because Qasem Soleimani was the great instigator of all this. You have to realize that Qasem Soleimani wasn't just an important figure in Iran at the time. Qasem Soleimani was both the hero of the Iran-Iraq war and a well-known figure, even appearing in video games and cartoons in Iran. He was the man behind the creation of Hezbollah, the man who had the takeover of Iraq following the American invasion and subsequent withdrawal from Iraq. Thanks to Soleimani's ability to place his pawns everywhere inside the country, Iran was able to siphon off an estimated $300 billion of the $800 billion invested by the United States in the reconstruction of Iraq. It is therefore estimated that around $300 billion were diverted to Iran. thanks to the network set up by Qasem Soleimani. And Qasem Soleimani was seen as the number 2 man in the Iranian regime and was almost in a way Khamenei's successor of Khamenei. So killing Qasem Soleimani was really both an escalation and an American desire to put an end to it by striking directly at the head. At the time, I thought it was a rather clever strategy on the part of Donald Trump, who, when the American drone was shot down, explained that he had refused to launch retaliatory strikes because he didn't want to kill Iranian civilians who had done nothing or risk injuring them for a drone that represented money, but it was only money. And then he went on to kill Qasem Soleimani. I thought that was a clever move because at the same time it avoided uniting the Iranians behind the mullah's regime by making it clear that the aim was not to strike at the Iranian people, and secondly because the best way to calm down this kind of regime is to send a signal to its elites that they're the ones who will be targeted if anything happens. Right away it's bound to change things a bit, but it's very difficult to know exactly what the consequences were. Did it put a stop to Iran's velleity? Because as you'll remember, 2 months later came COVID, and COVID in Iran in particular had caused quite a few problems at the outset. The country suffered and there were stories of ministers dying. In the beginning, things were pretty tough. And so, as in many parts of the world, it's true that the coronavirus epidemic has frozen the geostrategic situation in quite a few places. That's what I thought at the time. In retrospect, when you look back, it really does seem that way. Because in the end, since Oct 7th, we feel like we've returned, been corrected of what confrontation was like before that. Because everything is back. In other words, the Houthis were calming down with Saudi Arabia. Now the Saudis don't want to get their hands on it, but it's back on. Can you show us the map of Iran's influence? It's high up. You can see the Archie and the Iranian proxy in Yemen. Importantly, the Iranian proxy in Yemen, I wanted to say a word about that. I said a word about it the other day in my geopolitical bulletin, but I think it's important to point it out. Yemen, you have to realize, if you look at it, we often get the impression that the Houthis in Yemen are just a few scattered rebels. But in reality, you have pretty much the entire western third, western of the country in the hands of the Houthis, the Houthi rebels. The reality is that it's not just the Houthi rebels. Today, the de facto dominant power in Yemen is the Houthis. And why is that? Because they hold a third of the territory, but it's the most populous third. You've got 3/4 of the population there, so that's about 2 million people. To put it roughly, they hold the capital, Sana'a, which is in this region, and has a population of over 2 million, more than 2 million inhabitants. So when you hold 2/3 of a country's population, between 2/3 and 3/4, and the country's capital, you're not a rebel, you're that country. Otherwise, it's like today, if you said you were talking about the rebels of the Chinese Communist Party and the legitimate government of Taiwan, you see, we were still doing it in the years of 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 whatever. But today, it doesn't make much sense. We've come to the point where it's clear that in reality, Iran, through the Houthis, holds most of Yemen. Most of Yemen, the most important part. This means that the Houthis, when you hold several tens of millions of people, you have a significant human base, and there are around 200,000. That's around 200,000 fighters, the Houthis rebels. You have to realize that. In other words, the dimensions of the Houthi problem, we're dealing with something of the same order of magnitude as Syria or Iraq at the time, in terms of population and even demographic size, and with a geography that is often as nightmarish as that of Afghanistan. So it's a very big problem, the problem of the Houthis, and as much as the Americans have launched a few bombing raids to curb the Houthis' ability to disrupt regional traffic, it would appear difficult to achieve any convincing results without sending in ground troops. And it's unlikely that anyone in the West would want to send in ground troops to face 200 Houthis and then become an occupying power. After all, Iraq and Afghanistan have left some very bad memories. So in the end, the disarming them, and as long as they're supported and armed by Iran, that's going to pose major problems. Therefore, this is the current strategic situation of Iran. Roughly speaking, it has its architect. It holds, for a whole decade, the Saudis have persistently attempted to detach themselves, making continuous efforts to disengage themselves from the situation. But they haven't succeeded, so it seems difficult to get there now with just a few bombings. So I come back to the central question, what can Iran be looking for in this situation of initial imperialism? Naturally, it wants to seek regional domination. It wants to establish itself as the leading regional power. The thing is, I said that, I didn't say anything. What's the point if it won't lead anywhere? What would it be like if Iran were the leading regional power and satisfied with its lot? It would be an Iran that managed to impose its law on the West. In other words, to truly hold the Bab el-Mandeb straight. I forgot to mention that, but the Iranians, as I also mentioned in the newsletter, also have this. The Iranians boarded an oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz last week, which is considered defensible under international law, as it was done to combat theft. Although not by itself an act of war, the intention behind their actions remains clear. So they're sending out the message that Iran, as a regional power, would be an Iran that finally in control of the two straits of HMBLM of Bab el-Mandeb. And that would give Iran absolutely considerable power, even on a global scale. And this brings you right back to the idea of initial imperialism, which is that a country can box somewhere beyond its category if it has particularly powerful leverage. In this case, Iran has it. Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia are unhampered by the ongoing tensions. Despite the circumstances, which haven't yet called these relations into question, there has been no recent escalation between the two countries. It could start, but it's complicated for Saudi Arabia, which doesn't want to appear to be siding with Israel against Gaza, since that's the narrative that Iran manages to impose in the region. So in all likelihood, the objective is to remove Westerners from the area, expel them by threatening their ships. We know that they have fired on a number of Western ships. We deserted the area because it was too expensive to use anti-aircraft against what they were firing. It's always the same. They launch drones that don't cost much, and we intercept them with expensive missiles. What's more, we're short of missiles, so it's not easy. So with these tools, they probably intend to tire out the West until control of the straits is finally de facto passes under their control and can no longer be contested. Moreover, the tools have sent the signal that Russian and Chinese merchant ships would not be impacted, would not be hit if they tried to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So I'm not sure that the Chinese and Russian ship owners, it's going to be enough for them, because I don't know, if you're spending tens of millions of dollars on a cargo, you don't want them to shoot you by mistake, even just by mistake. The signal may not be enough, but in any case, it sends out a political signal about what we're trying to do. In other words, under the guise of blackmail or the pressure being exerted to stop the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, because he won't do that until the Israelis stop bombing Gaza, Iran's real aim is to get the West out of the straits. And behind the Iranian will, naturally, and it's even compatible with it, there's a Chinese and Russian will to get the Westerners out of that corner, because it would also enable the bloc to establish a direct corridor to Africa, where the entire bloc has been planning for several years now, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians. So that's the role in this system that Iran has assigned itself. It's a willingness to act as a bridge. And while Iran may not be in the same league as China or Russia, its position enables it to truly establish itself as a regional power, to become an essential partner, and thus, ultimately, to speak on an equal footing with these two powers. So that's what Iran is trying to do in the Straits. It's the same thing Iran is actually trying to do in Iraq today, because when Iran has its pro-Iranian Iraqi militias strike American bases, it's quite simply with the aim that the Americans will get bored and simply leave. And the Iranians may think that's what's going to happen, because they've seen Afghanistan leave with their tails between their legs. And so they may say to themselves, we're going to do the same thing, expel it, and that way there'll be no more Western presence either in the Straits or in Iraq, Syria, and from then on we'll be the stooge, because we've calmed Saudi Arabia down and it's made peace with us, but it's understood who's really in charge. That's how the Iranians must think today. And so in all likelihood, Iran's ambition today is that of a country aiming to control the Middle East. Middle East, clearly. There are hurdles in Iran's way, cost Iran its success in the end, and will lead to the downfall of the mullah's regime, since the bloc will lose this entire war. So what are these obstacles? The first obstacle, of course, is the fact that Iran is not the only candidate for hegemony in this part of the world. Erdogan's Turkey, and here we're dealing with a conflict that goes back a long way. Since as far back as the 16th century, the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were already battling it out in this part of the world, so it's one of the oldest rivalries in the world. And Turkey, what it's trying to do in the first place, let me remind you, it has ambitions that have been constant since Ataturk. Ataturk couldn't attempt it because the territory was controlled by the French and the British. But Erdogan's desire is to seize the north of Syria, northern Syria, in other words, the distant Syrian heartland and the distant Iraqi heartland. Basically, that's what the Turks want to conquer. They feel they don't have enough problems with the Kurds they have at home, so they want to go and take over those of others. That's what the Turks want to do, and they're already doing it in part, since they already have bases, outposts in the remote heart of Iraq. And of course, as you may know, they have since resumed their strikes very strongly. Since then, there have been PKK strikes on Turkish bases. The struggle between the Syrian Kurds and the Turks is resuming in full force, bringing back a significant confrontation once again in earnest. The situation had calmed down a little when the earthquake struck last year, killing around 50,000 people and affected Turkey and Syria. So there's this Turkish ambition in northern Syria and northern Iraq. There's the Turkish ambition towards the Caspian Sea, of course, and therefore to reach Azerbaijan and establish territorial continuity with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, after sending out signals that it would negotiate with Armenia, is now blowing hot and cold and is now talking more and more the desire to reactivate what they call Western Azerbaijan. In other words, an irredentist will in the famous Sunik area, which is where the Zangezur corridor is supposed to be located, i.e. that piece of Armenian territory that links up with Iranian territory. And you know that on this territory, Iran sent a signal during the last war that saw the rapid conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan. The Iranians had said they would go to war directly against Azerbaijan themselves if Azerbaijan ever tried to conquer this territory of Armenian South. Since then, the situation between Azerbaijan and Iran has calmed down considerably, with Iran offering to build a road through Iranian territory to link up with and bypass Armenian territory. At first, the Azerbaijanis seemed to say that this was an acceptable alternative solution, but they reiterated last week or 2 weeks ago that even this Iranian solution would not replace their right to have a direct passage through Armenian territory. So now they're putting pressure on them. Knowing that, on top of that, in recent years there have been enormous tensions between Azerbaijan and Iran because Iran still always thinks that the Azerbaijanis might try to stir up the Azeri community, i.e. the ethnic group to which Azerbaijan belongs, the Azeri community in northeastern Iran, in order to stir up these separatists. In general, Iran is a country surrounded by separatist fears, whether from the Azeris in the northeast or the Iranian Kurds in the east, which I mentioned earlier, the Baluchis on the Pakistani border, and then problems from Afghanistan. Iran is facing issues from multiple directions at present. But then, very clearly, if Iran's objective of expelling Westerners from the region were not to be accepted very kindly by Turkey and its ambitions to establish continuity with Azerbaijan, there will probably be a risk of confrontation in that area. And conversely, even if there is no direct confrontation in that corner, if there around Iran and Iran loses it, Azerbaijan will probably take advantage of the situation to finish off Armenia. So this will be a major obstacle. I'm putting aside, of course, the obstacle that, generally speaking, will be the Western reaction because we don't yet know what the Americans will do and we don't yet know what Israel will do. If Israel decides to settle its score with Hezbollah, of course, in the same dynamic, this could create a kind of vice for Iran too, with Israel on one side of Syria and Erdogan's Turkey on the other. But perhaps the most important problem for Iran, Iraq is not internal because it is located outside the country, but it is still Iraq. I wanted to say a few words about Iraq because I think the big surprise and the big problem that could arise for Iran would be this. It would be, in fact, a nationalist reaction in Iraq against Iranian domination. And if I'm talking about this domination, this reaction is not just because after the strike in Iraqi Kurdistan, the Iraqi government protested vehemently against Iran about violation of its sovereignty, which may come as a surprise from a state that is considered to be totally subservient to Iran since the reduction of the American presence and the fall of the Saddam regime, and the fact that the regime is now in the hands of the Shiites who are linked to the Iranians naturally, traditionally. It's not just because of that, it's because in reality, if the Iraqi government itself is taking this stance today, is because there is extremely strong popular pressure in Iraq, nationalist and anti-Iranian, which has kind of gone under the radar. We haven't paid too much attention to it. But very clearly, and we're back to this 2020 coronavirus problem in a way, that's what was very clearly taking shape at the end of the year of 19. That's another reason why I say we're closing the gap today. But what does that mean? To understand what it means, we need to do a little the history of Iraq. I'm not going to do the same thing as the great programs I've done on the historionomy of this or that, but it's worth saying Iraq. Iraq, as you know, Iraq had been in the hands of the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century. So Iraq didn't become independent until the end of the First World War and the appearance of British and French mandates in the region. And from then on, as in many other countries, in the Middle East and beyond, the emergence of Arab socialism corresponded in Iraqi national construction to the stage in our Europe of administrative autocracy or administrative monarchy, i.e. the imperial regime that creates the state, which then in the course of a national revolution switched to a parliamentary nation state. Saddam Hussein was an autocratic ruler in Iraq, an absolute monarch in Iraq, to cut a long story short. A bit like she was Iran's cat after all, except that Iraq was a little behind Iran in its national construction. Iraq was rather on the same level as Syria. In fact, the two states have an ethno-historical cultural continuity, which in a way could have made them a single entity. What's more, at the time, there was the will at the time of Hafez al-Assad, and I forget his name, his predecessor. I think his name was al-Bakr, Saddam Hussein's predecessor. There was a desire, since they were all members of the lower party, it was the same party in Syria and Iraq, the local party. Their intention was to create a Syrian-Iraqi union. It was in line with the idea of the Great United Arab Republic. After the failure of the Egyptian side, there was a desire to do something Syrian-Iraqi. Saddam Hussein opposed the idea both out of a nationalist desire and out of personal ambition, since he would have felt a feud with Hafez al-Assad in such a system. So he didn't want it, but it could have been done, and that's not surprising, as I was saying, because these two territories have a great deal of continuity going back to high antiquity. It was the Assyrian Empire, that's what it was. So they're really completely at one with the national revolution. Let's come back to a subject I've already mentioned. It's that the revolution that began in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring in Egypt, as I've already said, I refer you to the great program I did on the historian of the Arab world, Arab Muslim world. But the Arab Spring is the launch of a simultaneous national revolution in a number of countries, including Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Well, not Iraq, I'll come back to that, but take Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria to see how they fit in with the model. So it's undoubtedly the launch of a national revolution. And so what I've already had occasion to say at this time and time again, is that if Iraq hadn't been invaded by the Americans in 2003 and the Iraqi state destroyed by the Americans, in fact, because Saddam Hussein's Iraqi state had elites that were mainly Sunni. So from the moment they got the Sunnis out of power and replaced them with the Yaqid, it was a total renewal. So there you have it. But if the Americans hadn't done it, the Arab Spring would have happened just the same, and it would probably have toppled an aging Saddam Hussein, who would have been in his 70s by then. And so probably, in fact, it would have mirrored what happened in Syria, because the proportions are reversed. In Syria, you had 20% religious minorities, mainly Alawites, against 80% Sunnis, 70 or 80% more or less. In Iraq, the proportion was the opposite. You had 30% Sunni, 70% Shiite, or 80%. These proportions were found in both armies, with the minority among the cadres and the majority essentially among the troops. And so the way in which the Syrian state collapsed under al-Assad tanks in 2001-2012, the same thing would have happened for the same reasons in Saddam's Iraq if Saddam had been there. What's more, Iran next door would have, as they did in the context of the American invasion, but here they would have done it in the context of the uprisings. They would have stirred up the anger of the Shiites, and so the Iraqi state would have sunk into a national revolution. What's all this to say? All this to say that de facto, in spite of the American intervention, which in fact had no long-term effect since we fell back on what would have happened anyway if it had never come, this means that normally Iraq is at the stage where it should have been, but we can consider that it is now in the midst of a national revolution. And the national revolution, as you know, is nationalist. And that explains why the Iraqis, after receiving assistance from Iran, etc., to fight against the Americans, revolted against Iranian domination from the year off. In 2019, you had demonstrations that were launched, and they were national demonstrations. During that period, a majority of Iraq's population was comprised of young individuals, with roughly 60% of its inhabitants being under the age of 25, unemployed. So that tells you the social problem this posed. So the first demonstrations were against the state and public services, against corruption, because naturally, when you have unemployed populations, they tend to think it's due to the corruption of the elites and so on. So it's the kind of demonstrations we've seen which are very similar to the kind of demonstrations that launched the fall of Ben Ali, or the kind of demonstrations we'd seen multiplying in the Warsaw Pact countries, for example. You had a regime crackdown that was launched at that. You've got Muqtada al-Sadr, brother who, first of all, for a while, who's a local mullah, in fact, rather pro-Iranian, who for a while he was a member of the coalition government, but he did support the demonstrators a little. Protesters, there were new demonstrations, so basically there were several waves, but it was between October 2019 and January 2020. And what's very interesting is that as time went by, the slogans changed. At first they said, we want work, and then they started saying, we want a homeland, we want a country, and Iran out. And that really became the main slogan, Iran out, during those few months. There was a general strike, and that's when the Americans shot Qasem Soleimani, who was, I repeat, the great organizer of this Iranian domination in Iraq. But there was repression on the part of the Iranians. The big question is, I don't know. I haven't found any information on this. Disengagement from Soleimani, was it just a desire to put a stop to Iran's assertiveness, Iranian assertiveness, or was there also the idea of encouraging this Iraqi anti-Iranian movement? I don't know about that. In any case, even if there had been this American will, as the United States was then caught practically frozen by the COVID for 6 months, plus the COVID during the Trump period, when the entire deep state was using the COVID to discredit Donald Trump. But naturally, all these things took a back seat. So presumably, this has enabled Iran to re-establish its stake. At the same time as there was also repression in Iran, even against certain demonstrations that had taken place after the Iranians had shot down a plane. I think it was a Ukrainian plane as well, poor guys. They really had it all in the skies over Tehran, thinking it was actually an American attack. So what does this mean? It means that this movement, probably Iraqi, is still there. The independent will is still there. The Iraqi elites in power today know this. And so they know very well that they can't afford to be stepped on by the Iranian authorities without running the risk of being outflanked again by their own people and of having more demonstrations. The demonstrations weren't just any old thing. You've had governorate headquarters burnt down by demonstrators, so it was a pretty solid thing that happened. These were tough demonstrations. If it hadn't been for Iran supporting the Iraqi regime and keeping it in place, it's likely that the Iraqi regime would have fallen in the same way as Ben Ali, for example, in Tunisia. Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen, but for me, very clearly, historionomically, we'd have to say Iraq is in that phase, that nationalist phase. And it's interesting because if we draw a parallel, in a way it puts Iraq in the same situation with regard to Iran than Ukraine was a few years ago, i.e. before the Russian invasion. Russian invasion in Ukraine, i.e. Ukraine at the time of Maidan in relation to Russia, i.e. this young population who, for a good part of them, must have been brought up to hate Iran rather than love it, since these are people who grew up in the aftermath of the war, who were born in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, who endured hardship, witnessing 500,000 casualties on both sides. In the war against the Iranians, many struggle living under such strict guidance, especially those facing ethnic challenges. Iraqis are Arabs, while the Iranians are Persians, and that's always been a problem. And so the national will, if you like, the Iraqi nationalism, which was really already there at the time of Saddam Hussein, and this Iraqi nationalism existed. It carried the of Iraq against Iran. It wasn't just because Saddam Hussein was a dictator that he sent his people off to fight like that for 10 years. Clearly, there was also a popular narrative that spoke to people. So this Iraqi nationalism does exist. It exists, and in my opinion, it's the main danger for what Iran is trying to put in place. Iran is trying to set up today because that means it's the weak point. It's the weak point in this system, and that Turkey could play on that to cut off the Shiite crescent. If the Iranian or pro-Iranian militias in Iraq start having difficulties, if, for example, Iran tries to catch Hezbollah directly, postpone its war, consider that it has finished in Gaza, and therefore also settle the Hezbollah problem, and the Iranians try to intervene directly against Israel, or at any rate by using these Iraqi militias, several things could happen. You can have people demonstrating against these militias in Iraq and opposing them because they don't want to get involved in the conflict. You can simply have Iraqi militias joining the front line in Lebanon or South Syria and Lebanon against Israel, who are decimated there, or in any case suffer losses and are in any case no longer in Iraq. And at that point, there's no one left to hold the Iraqi population to its anti-Iranian will, since the gendarmes wouldn't be there. From here, you can imagine a wide range of scenarios scenarios on a spectrum, such as Iran's direct repression in Iraq or direct intervention by the Revolutionary Guards to maintain the situation. The possibilities are diverse and abundant, and it's not at all implausible that it could end up in Iraq, that Iran is most exhausted in its desire in this conflict, this attempt to create a hegemony over the Middle East. That's what I wanted to say on the subject, simply to shed a little light on the subject. By the way, if you could just give me the map of what was in the atlas, Leo, please. Because in the show I was digging into the rails of history, where I had recalibrated the forecasts in relation to the Atlas of Future Wars, but I had mainly talked about China and Russia in Europe. I hadn't talked too much about Iran, so I'd like to redetail that today. These are the projections I made of what Iran might want to do in the Atlas of Future Wars. The problem was that at the time, my vision of Roman Tsar imperialism was still in its infancy. I didn't even know what the state of national construction was, since the structure of history was published more than a year after the Atlas of Future Wars. So these were things I didn't yet have in mind. And so the projection I had made of what Iran might try to do was an attempt to adapt what Italy had done, for example, in the Mediterranean world of the Second World War, since I'm skimming the same waters, if you like, with Iran in relation to Russia, to what Mussolini's Italy was in relation to Hitler's Germany. I've said this before, we can't make the exact comparison, since Iran, as I mentioned earlier, was experiencing a phase of initial imperialism rather than seeking revenge. It differs significantly from the latter. Mussolini's Italy, which was a revanchist imperialism, so making a projection just on that basis didn't really hold water. The idea that Iran wants to take over parts of Saudi territory where there's oil, etc., is something that's not really there, etc., is something I'd like to come back to. I don't think there's any Iranian desire to invade Saudi Arabia. I don't think there would be any Iranian desire to invade Saudi Arabia, because that's what revenge imperialists do, try to take over territories like that. Initial imperialism, on the other hand, seeks to place the country in a position of overhang, a hegemonic position, even if this means intervening left and right. So the Iranian desire today would not be to conquer territory just like that, but to become hegemonic in that space by expelling Westerners, Americans in particular, from Iraq and Syria, and in general, Westerners from control of the Straits, and in particular, the Red Sea. This is what Iran really wants. Iranian will. So naturally, I have to disavow it in a way, to a certain extent, because it's still the area, roughly speaking, that Iran is clearly seeking to dominate, and that's not changing, but not by taking territory in Saudi Arabia and so on, rather with localized conflicts essentially against Westerners, because the aim is to expel Westerners from this area. And so if you can put back the map of the general projections I had put up, it's up. So that explains, I'll remind you that these were the two projections, basically the range I proposed in the Atlas of Future Wars. At the top was the maximum range of Chinese and Russian-Iranian domination. In the middle was the minimum hypothesis of Russian and Chinese attack. Here again, I'd like to point out that I didn't quite identify the Chinese trajectory and didn't understand that, like Iran today, China is in the initial imperialist phase, not the revenge imperialist phase, unlike Japan. So I had the same problem with Japan as with Italy in the Atlas version. In other words, a maximalist hypothesis around Russia, as always, a rather minimalist hypothesis around China, or at any rate a minimalist hypothesis for conflicts with an initial imperialism, i.e. localized conflicts, more an attempt to expel hegemonic space rather than conquering territory. So no Chinese invasion of the whole of Southeast Asia, but there will probably be conflicts. So in the Himalayas, I've already mentioned, against India, around Taiwan and perhaps around North Korea. We're going to do a program on North Korea in the near future to try to expel the American presence in particular, which is why China has expelled the American presence from the Western Pacific. And so for Iran, the Iranian part, you'd essentially have fighting around Israel, which is what I mentioned last time, around Israel and probably in Iraq. Explosions will be hotspots trying to expel Western power from region, to expel any Western power from the region. But ultimately, at the end of the conflict, it should fail. And in all likelihood, the regional winners of the conflict will be Turkey, Azerbaijan. But then Azerbaijan is a vassal state of Turkey. So essentially, Erdogan's Turkey will be the big winner. Iraq, presumably, which could win its re-independence. And of course, Israel, which will come out of this conflict alive, and probably with a calmer relationship and further normalization towards the Sunni powers. My vision of the conflict.